Your brain is smaller than your ancestors' brains were. Not a little, not a rounding error. If you lined up your skull next to a human skull from 20,000 years ago, same species, same Homo sapiens, someone you could have a conversation with, theirs would hold noticeably more brain than yours, about a tennis ball's worth more, by some estimates, somewhere between 10 and 13%. We got smarter, we built cities, computers, spacecraft, and somewhere along the way our brains got smaller. That's already strange enough. But it gets worse. Because there's a real documented process where brain cells will literally start consuming the tissue around them, eating your own connections, digesting your own neurons. It has a name. It happens in every skull, including the one you're using to watch this. So the horror movie version of the question, did ancient humans' brains eat themselves, isn't quite right. The real answer is stranger. Because the eating never stopped. It's happening in your head right now. The only question is whether it's saving you or slowly hollowing you out. Let me show you what's actually going on in there, because two completely different things are hiding behind that one creepy phrase, and both are true. Let's start with the shrinking, because it's one of the most quietly embarrassing facts in all of human evolution. For 6 million years, the story of the human brain was up. Our ancestors' brains nearly quadrupled in size since we split from chimpanzees. Bigger, bigger, bigger. That's the whole triumphant narrative. The big brain is the thing that made us us. It's on every museum poster. And then, at some point in the last chunk of our history, the graph turns around and heads down. The brains of Homo sapiens today are roughly 13% smaller than those of the humans who lived during the last ice age. Not a different species, not some knuckle-dragging ancestor, people like you, who, at least by this one measure, were packing more gray matter than you are. Here's the line that should bother you. The peak of the human brain is behind us. Now, and I have to be honest here, because this is exactly the kind of fact that gets mangled into clickbait, scientists absolutely do not agree on when this happened or why. This is a live, kind of vicious argument, and the disagreement is the interesting part, so let me actually walk you through the fight. One camp says the shrinking started around 100,000 years ago, right when humans began making symbolic art, carving meaningful patterns, and maybe inventing language. The idea is beautiful. Once you can offload your thinking into words, into symbols, into shared knowledge, you don't need to brute force everything with raw brain volume anymore. A smaller, better wired brain could do more with less. On this view, we didn't lose power. We got efficient. We swapped a giant clumsy engine for a smaller, smarter one. Another camp looks at that and says, the data doesn't hold up. Show us the steady decline from 100,000 years ago. They argue the real shrinking is much more recent, maybe the last 17,000 years or so, right as the ice age ended and the planet warmed up. And their explanation is almost funny in how mundane it is. Heat your brain is a furnace. It's about 2% of your body weight, and it burns over 20% of your energy at rest. A big brain runs hot. So when the world warmed up, maybe a slightly smaller brain was just easier to cool. We didn't shrink because we got clever. We shrank because we were overheating. Sit with that one. The crown jewel of human evolution, possibly trimmed down for the same reason you take your jacket off in summer. But there's a third theory, and it's the one that really stings. This camp points at roughly the time we stopped being hunter-gatherers, settled down, and built complex societies, some say as recently as a few thousand years ago. Though that early date is now heavily disputed, and many researchers push it back further. And their argument is brutal in its simplicity. When you live in a big, complex society, you don't have to know everything anymore. A hunter-gatherer had to be a walking encyclopedia. Which plants heal and which ones kill. How to track an animal for 2 days. How to read weather, make fire, navigate by stars, build shelter, fix every tool they owned. Every single person carried a huge chunk of the group's survival knowledge in their own skull. Then we invented specialists. The farmer, the potter, the priest, the soldier. Suddenly you could get through an entire life knowing your one job and trusting everyone else to know theirs. Knowledge moved out of individual heads and into the group. And here's the uncomfortable punchline. The brain is expensive, and biology does not pay for what it doesn't use. Civilization may have let us think less, so we grew the hardware to match. Now, before anyone spirals, this does not mean the ancients were geniuses and we're idiots. That's the trap. And I want to be careful because this is where bad science videos go to die. Brain size is a genuinely lousy measure of intelligence. Men's brains average about 11% bigger than women's purely because of body size, and there's no intelligence gap. Some small-brained human relatives seem to have pulled off surprisingly complex behavior. It's the wiring, not the raw volume, that seems to matter most. And honestly, the most likely truth is boring and human. It's probably not one of these theories. It's probably a messy tangle of all of them at once. Language, heat, diet, society, arguing with each other across thousands of years. When a scientist tells you they know exactly why our brains shrank, hold on to your wallet. The fossil record is patchy, older bones are rarer. And the honest answer is that we genuinely don't fully know yet. So that's the slow eating, a species quietly trimming its own brain across thousands of years. But I told you there was a second, faster kind, the one happening in your head tonight. And this is where the horror movie phrase turns out to be literally biologically true. Now flip the whole picture around. Forget the species. Forget the millennia. Zoom all the way in down to a single brain over a single night. Inside your skull right now, there are cells whose entire job is to eat other parts of your brain. They're called microglia, and they're the brain's cleanup crew. They crawl through the tissue, and they reach out to your synapses, the connections between your neurons. The physical wiring of every memory and skill and thought you have, and the weak ones, the ones you barely use, they consume. They wrap around them and digest them and clear them away. The brain calls this maintenance. Scientists call it synaptic pruning. And the principle behind it is the single most ruthless rule in your own head: use it or lose it. And lose it means eaten. This isn't a malfunction. This is the design. When you were a baby, your brain was a wild, overgrown jungle of far too many connections, way more than you'd ever need. And childhood, in a very real sense, was the process of your brain pruning itself down, cutting away the connections you didn't use so the ones you did could grow strong. The reason you can't easily learn a native accent as an adult, but a toddler soaks up 2 languages effortlessly, part of that is the jungle getting cleared. The pruning shears came out. The connections you didn't feed got eaten. Your mind, in a real sense, was carved out of a much larger one. You are the sculpture. Everything they cut away was the marble. But here's the part that connects to that ancient sleep we might have talked about before, and it's the tell that changes everything. This pruning, this eating, seems to happen most during sleep. While you're unconscious, the cleanup crew goes to work. The glymphatic system flushes out waste, the microglia trim the weak connections. Your brain is quite literally taking out the trash and doing renovations while the lights are off. That groggy feeling after a bad night isn't just tiredness, it's a house that never got cleaned. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. When researchers looked at what happens to this crew under chronic sleep deprivation when you never let the lights go off properly, the microglia don't stop. Some evidence suggests they go into overdrive. The cleanup crew that's supposed to gently trim the weak wiring starts getting overzealous. The careful gardener starts hacking. So the horror movie framing finally comes true, but with a twist nobody expects. Your brain eating itself isn't the disaster. Your brain eating itself is how it stays healthy. The disaster is when you never sleep, and the eating stops being gardening and starts being demolition. The gardener keeps you alive. Fire the gardener, and the garden doesn't grow wild and free. It gets devoured. So let's put the two halves back together, because they rhyme in a way I find almost eerie. At the scale of the whole species, across thousands of years, we trimmed our own brains down, shedding the excess our new world let us shed. And at the scale of a single skull, across a single night, we do the exact same thing in miniature, trimming the connections our day didn't need, sculpting a sharper mind out of a rougher one. Same principle, 2 wildly different clocks. Bigger is not better. Leaner, cleaner, better wired, that's the thing evolution and your own sleeping brain both seem to be chasing. Not more marble. A better statue. And that reframes the whole scary question, doesn't it? Did ancient humans' brains eat themselves? Yes, and so does yours, every single night. But it was never cannibalism, it was craftsmanship. Here's the thought I'll leave you with. We tend to assume that more is always better. More memory, more storage, more capacity. The whole modern world is built on accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. never delete, save everything. And we look at our shrinking brains almost like a loss, like we misplaced something precious our ancestors had. But your brain has known the opposite truth for your entire life, that the mind you actually want isn't the one that keeps everything. It's the one brave enough to let go of what it doesn't need. To prune, to forget, to clear the jungle so a few strong things can grow tall. Every night, in the dark, some quiet part of you decides what's worth keeping and what to let dissolve. It has been doing this since before you had words for any of it, and you wake up, most mornings, feeling a little clearer without ever knowing that the clarity was carved, not given. You are not the sum of everything you've ever held on to. You are what survived the pruning.